second iteration, with subsequent drawings of the fractal curve. Sudden changes may appear. Ian Malcolm. The shore of the inland sea. Alan Grant crouched down, his nose inches from the ground. The temperature was over 100 degrees. His knees ached, despite the rug layers pads he wore. His lungs burned from the harsh alkaline dust. Sweat dripped off his forehead onto the ground, but Grant was oblivious to the discomfort. His entire attention was focused on the 6-inch square of earth in front of him. Working patiently with a dental pick and an artist's camel brush, he exposed the tiny L-shaped fragment of jawbone. It was only an inch long and no thicker than his little finger. The teeth were a row of small points and had the characteristics medial angling. Bits of bone flaked away as he dug. Grant paused for a moment to paint the bone with rubber cement before continuing to expose it. There was no question that this was the jawbone from an infant carnivorous dinosaur. Its owner had died 79 million years ago, at the age of about 2 months. With any luck, Grant might find the rest of the skeleton as well. If so, it would be the first complete skeleton of a baby carnivore. Hey, Alan. Alan Grant looked up, blinking in the sunlight. He pulled down his sunglasses and wiped his forehead with the back of his arm. He was crouched on an eroded hillside in the Badlands outside Snakewater, Montana. Beneath the great blue bowl of the sky, blunted hills, exposed outcroppings of crumbling limestone, stretched for miles in every direction. There was not a tree or a bush. Nothing but barren rock, hot sun, and running wind. Visitors found the Badlands depressingly bleak, but when Grant looked at this landscape, he saw something else entirely. This barren land was what remained of another very different world, which had vanished 80 million years ago. In his mind's eye, Grant saw himself back in the warm, swampy bayou that formed the shoreline of a great inland sea. This inland sea was 1,000 miles wide, extending all the way from the newly upthrust Rocky Mountains to the sharp, craggy peaks of the Appalachians. All of the American West was underwater. At that time, there were thin clouds in the sky overhead, darkened by the smoke of nearby volcanoes. The atmosphere was denser, richer in carbon dioxide. Plants grew rapidly along the shoreline. There were no fish in these waters, but there were clams and snails. Pterosaurs swooped down to scoop algae from the surface. A few carnivorous dinosaurs prowled the swampy shores of the lake, moving among the palm trees. and offshore was a small island about 2 acres in size, ringed with dense vegetation. This island formed a protected sanctuary where herds of herbivorous duck-billed dinosaurs laid their eggs in communal nests and raised their squeaking young. Over the millions of years that followed, the pale green alkaline lake grew shallower and finally vanished. The exposed land buckled and cracked under the heat. An offshore island with its dinosaurs' eggs became the eroded hillside in northern Montana, which Alan Grant was now excavating. Hey, Alan. He stood, a barrel-chested, bearded man of 40. He heard the chugging of the portable generator and the distant clatter of the jackhammer cutting into the dense rock. On the next hill, he saw the kids working around the jackhammer, moving away the big pieces of rock after checking them for fossils. At the foot of the hill, he saw the 6 teepees of his camp, the flapping mess tent, and the trailer that served as their field laboratory. And he saw Ellie waving to him from the shadow of the field laboratory. "Visitor," she called, and pointed to the east. Grant saw the cloud of dust and the blue Ford sedan bouncing over the rutted road toward them. He glanced at his watch. Right on time. On the other hill, the kids looked up with interest. They didn't get many visitors in Snake Water, and there had been a lot of speculation about what a lawyer from the Environmental Protection Agency would want to see Alan Grant about. But Grant knew that paleontology, the study of extinct life, had in recent years taken on an unexpected relevance to the modern world. The modern world was changing fast, and urgent questions about the weather, deforestation, global warming, or the ozone layer often seemed answerable, at least in part with information from the past, information that paleontologists could provide. He had been called as an expert witness twice in the past few years. Grant started down the hill to meet the car. The visitor coughed in the white dust as he slammed the car door. "Bob Morse, EPA," he said, extending his hand. "I'm with the San Francisco office." Grant introduced himself and said, "You look hot. Want a beer?" "Jesus, yeah." Morse was in his late 20s, wearing a tie and pants from a business suit. He carried a briefcase. His ring-tip shoes crunched on the rocks as they walked towards the trailer. "When I first came over the hill, I thought this was an Indian reservation," Morse said, pointing to the teepees. "No," Grant said. "Just the best way to live out here." Grant explained that in 1978, the first year of the excavations, they had come out in North Slope octahedral tents, the most advanced available, but the tents always blew over in the wind. They tried other kind of tents with the same result. Finally, they started putting up teepees, which were larger inside, more comfortable, and more stable in wind. These are Blackfoot teepees, built around the 4 poles, Grant said. Sioux teepees are built around 3. But these used to be Blackfoot territory, so we thought, Morse said, very fitting. He squinted at the desolate landscape and shook his head. How long you been out here? About 60 cases, Grant said. When Morse looked surprised, he explained, we measure time in beer. We start in June with 100 cases. We've gone through about 60 so far, 63 to be exact, Ellie Sattler said, as they reached the trailer. Grant was amused to see Morse gaping at her. Ellie was wearing cut-off jeans and a work shirt tied at her midriff. She was 24 and darkly tanned. Her blonde hair was pulled back. Ellie keeps us going, Grant said, introducing her. She's very good at what she does. What does she do? Morse asked. Paleobotany, Ellie said. And I also do the standard field preps. She opened the door and they went inside. The air conditioning in the trailer only brought the temperature down to 85 degrees, but it seemed cool after the midday heat. The trailer had a series of long wooden tables with tiny bone specimens neatly laid out, tagged and labeled. Farther along were ceramic dishes and crocks. There was a strong odor of vinegar. Morse glanced at the bones. I thought dinosaurs were big, he said. They were, Ellie said, but everything you see here comes from babies. Snake water is important primarily because of the number of dinosaur nesting sites here. Until we started this work, there were hardly any infant dinosaurs known. Only one nest had ever been found in the Gobi Desert. We've discovered a dozen different hadrosaur nests, complete with eggs and bones of infants. While Grant went to the refrigerator, she showed Morse the acetic acid baths, which were used to dissolve away the limestone from the delicate bones. They look like chicken bones, Morse said, peering into the ceramic dishes. Yes, she said, they are very bird-like. And what about those? Morse said, pointing through the trailer window to piles of large bones outside, wrapped in heavy plastic. Rejects, Ellie said. Bones too fragmentary. When we took them out of the ground, in the old days we'd just discard them. But nowadays we send them for genetic testing. Genetic testing? Morse said. Here you go, Grant said, thrusting a bear into his hand. He gave another to Ellie. She chugged hers, throwing her long neck back. Morse stared. We're pretty informal here, Grant said. Want to step into my office? Sure. Morse said. Grant led him to the end of the trailer, where there was a torn couch, a sagging chair, and a battered end table. Grant dropped onto the couch, which creaked and exhaled a cloud of chalky dust. He leaned back, thumped his boots up on up on the end table and gestured for Morris to sit in the chair. Make yourself comfortable. Grant was a professor of paleontology at the University of Denver and one of the foremost researchers in his field. But he had never been comfortable with social niceties. He saw himself as an outdoor man, and he knew that all the important work in paleontology was done outdoors, with your hands. Grant had little patience for the academics, for the museum curators, for what he called teacup dinosaur hunters. And he took some pains to distance himself in dress and behavior from the teacup dinosaur hunters, even delivering his lectures in jeans and sneakers. Grant watched as Morris primarily brushed off the seat of the chair before he sat down. Morris opened his briefcase, rummaged through his papers, and glanced back at Ellie, who was lifting bones with tweezers from the acid bath at the other end of the trailer, paying no attention to them. You're probably wondering why I'm here, Grant nodded. It's a long way to come, Mr. Morris. Well, Morris said, to get right to the point, the EPA is concerned about the activities of the Hammond Foundation. You receive some funding from them. $30,000 a year, Grant said, nodding. For the last 5 years. What do you know about the foundation? Morris said. Grant shrugged. The Hammond Foundation is a respected source of academic grants. They fund research all over the world, including several dinosaur researchers. I know they support Bob Carey out of the Tyrrell in Alberta and John Weller in Alaska, probably more. Do you know why the Hammond Foundation supports so much dinosaur researcher? Morris asked. Of course, it's because old John Hammond is a dinosaur nut. You've met Hammond? Grant shrugged. Once or twice. He comes here for the brief visits. He's quite elderly, you know, and eccentric the way rich people sometimes are, but always very enthusiastic. Why? Well, Morris said, the Hammond Foundation is actually a rather mysterious organization. He pulled out a Xerox world map, marked with red dots, and passed it to Grant. These are the digs the Foundation financed last year. Notice anything odd about them? Montana, Alaska, Canada, Sweden. They're all sites in the north. They're nothing below the 45th parallel. Morse pulled out more maps. It's the same year after year. Dinosaur projects to the south in Utah or Colorado or Mexico never get funded. The Hammond Foundation only supports cold weather digs. We'd like to know why. Grant shuffled through the maps quickly. If it was true that the Foundation only supported cold weather digs, then it was strange behavior, because some of the best dinosaur researchers were working in hot climates, and there are other puzzles, Morse said. For example, What is the relationship of dinosaurs to amber? Amber? Yes, it's the hard yellow resin of dried tree sap. I know what it is, Grant said. But why are you asking? Because, Morse said, over the last 5 years, Hammond has purchased enormous quantities of amber in America, Europe, and Asia, including many pieces of museum-quality jewelry. The foundation has spent $17 million on amber. They now possess the largest privately held stock of this material in the world. I don't get it, Grant said. Neither does anybody else, Morse said. As far as we can tell, it doesn't make any sense at all. Amber is easily synthesized. It has no commercial or defense value. There's no reason to stockpile it. But Hammond has done just that over many years. Amber, Grant said, shaking his head. And what about this? And what about his island in Costa Rica? Morse continued. 10 years ago, the Hammond Foundation leased an island from the government of Costa Rica, supposedly to set up a biological preserve. I don't know anything about that, Grant said, frowning. I haven't been able to find out much, Morse said. The island is 100 miles off the west coast. It's very rugged, and it's in an area of ocean where the combinations of wind and current make it almost perpetually covered in fog. They used to call it Cloud Island, Isla Nublar. Apparently, the Costa Ricans were amazed that anybody would want it. Morse searched in his briefcase. The reason I mentioned it, he said, is that according to the records, you were paid a consultant's fee in connection with this island. I was, Grant said. Morse passed a sheet of paper to Grant. It was the Xerox of a check issued in March 1984 from Ingen Inc., Farallon Road, Palo Alto, California, made out to Alan Grant in the amount of $12,000. At the lower corner, the check was marked Consultant Service, Costa Rica, Juvenile Hyperspace. Oh, sure, Grant said. I remember that. It was weird as hell, but I remember it. And it didn't have anything to do with an island. Alan Grant had found the first clutch of dinosaur eggs in Montana in 1979, and many more in the next 2 years, but he hadn't gotten around to publishing his findings until 1983. His paper with its report of a herd of 10,000 duck-billed dinosaurs living along the shore of a vast inland sea, building communal nests of eggs in the mud, raising their infant dinosaurs in the herd, made Grant a celebrity overnight. The notion of maternal instincts in giant dinosaurs and the drawings of cute babies poking their snouts out of the eggs had appeal around the world. Grant was besieged with requests for interviews, lectures, books. Characteristically, he turned them all down, wanting only to continue his excavations. But it was during those frantic days of the mid-1980s that he was approached by the InGen Corporation with a request for consulting services. Had you heard of InGen before? Morse asked. No. How did they contact you? Telephone call. It was a man named Gennaro or Giannino, something like that. Morris nodded. Donald Gennaro, he said. He's the legal counsel for InGen. Anyway, he wanted to know about eating habits of dinosaurs, and he offered me a fee to draw up a paper for him. Grant drank his beer, set the can on the floor. Gennaro was particularly interested in young dinosaurs, infants and juveniles. What they ate, I guess he thought I would know about that. Did you? Not really, no. I told him that. We had found lots of skeletal material, but we had very little dietary data. But Gennaro said he knew we hadn't published everything, and he wanted whatever we had, and he offered a very large fee, $50,000. Morse took out the tape recorder and set it on the end table. You mind? No, go ahead. So Gennaro telephoned you in 1984. What happened then? Well, Grant said, you see our operation here? 50,000 would support 2 full summers of digging. I told him I'd do what I could. So you agreed to prepare a paper for him? Yes. On the dietary habits of juvenile dinosaurs? Yes. You met Gennaro? No, just on the phone. Did Gennaro say why he wanted this information? Yes, Grant said. He was planning a museum for children, and he wanted to feature baby dinosaurs. He said he was hiring a number of academic consultants and named them. There were paleontologists like me and a mathematician from Texas named Ian Malcolm and a couple of ecologists. A systems analyst. Good group. Morris nodded, making notes. So you accepted the consultancy? Yes. I agreed to send him a summary of our work. What we knew about the habits of the duck-billed hadrosaurs we'd found. What kind of information did you send? Morse asked. Everything. Nesting behavior, territorial ranges, feeding behavior, social behavior, everything. And how did Gennaro respond? He kept calling and calling, sometimes in the middle of the night. Would the dinosaurs eat this? Would they eat that? Should the exhibit include this? I could never understand why he was so worked up. I mean, I think dinosaurs are important too, but not that important. They've been dead 65 million years. You'd think his calls could wait until morning. I see, Morse said. And the $50,000? Grant shook his head. I got tired of Gennaro and called the whole thing off. We set it up for 12,000. That must have been about the middle of 85. Morse made a note. And InGen? Any other contact with them? Not since 1985. And when did the Hammond Foundation begin to fund your research? I'd have to look, Grant said, but it was around then, mid-80s. And you know Hammond as just a rich dinosaurs enthusiast? Yes. Morse made another note. Look, Grant said, if the EPA is so concerned about John Hammond and what he's doing, the dinosaur sites in the north, the amber purchases, the island in Costa Rica, why don't you just ask him about it? At the moment, we can't, Morse said. Why not? Grant said. Because we don't have any evidence of wrongdoing, Morse said. But personally, I think it's clear John Hammond is evading the law. I was first contacted, Morse explained, by the Office of Technology Transfer. The OTT monitors shipments of American technology which might have military significance. They called to say that InGen had 2 areas of possible illegal technology transfer. First, InGen shipped 3 Cray XMPs to Costa Rica. InGen characterized it as a transfer within corporate divisions and said they weren't for resale, but OTT couldn't imagine why the hell somebody need that power in Costa Rica. 3 Crays, Grant said. Is that a kind of computer? Morse nodded. Very powerful supercomputers. To put it in perspective, 3 Crays represent more computing power than any other privately held company in America. And InGen sent the machines to Costa Rica. You have to wonder why. I give up. Why? Grant said. Nobody knows, and the hoods are even more worrisome. Morse continued. Hoods are automated gene sequences machines that work out the genetic code by themselves. They are so new that they haven't been put on the restricted list yet. But any genetic engineering lab is likely to have one. If it can afford the $500,000 price tag. He flipped through his notes. Well, it seems InGen shipped 24 hood sequencers to their island in Costa Rica. Again, they said it was a transfer within divisions, not an export. Morse said there wasn't much that OTT could do. They're not officially concerned with use, but InGen was obviously setting up one of the most powerful genetic engineering facilities in the world in an obscure Central American country. A country with no regulations. That kind of thing has happened before. There had already been cases of American bioengineering companies moving to another country so they would not be hampered by regulations and rules. The most flagrant, Morse explained, was the Bison rabies case. In 1986, Genetic Biosin Corporation of Cupertino tested a bioengineered rabies vaccine on a farm in Chile. They didn't inform the government of Chile or the farm workers involved. They simply released the vaccine. The vaccine consisted of a live rabies virus, genetically modified to be non-virulent, but the virulency hadn't been tested. Biosin didn't know whether the virus could still cause rabies or not. Even worse, the virus had been modified. Ordinarily, you couldn't contract rabies unless you were bitten by an animal. But Biosin modified the rabies virus to cross the pulmonary alveoli. You could get an infection just inhaling it. Bison staffers brought this live rabies virus down to Chile in a carry-on bag on a commercial airline flight. Mars often wondered what would have happened if the capsule had broken open during the flight. Everybody on the plane might have been infected with rabies. It was outrageous. It was irresponsible. It was criminally negligent. But no action was taken against Biosyn. The Chilean farmers who unwittingly risked their lives were ignorant peasants. The government of Chile had an economic crisis to worry about, and the American authorities had no jurisdiction, so Louis Dodgson, the geneticist responsible for the test, was still working at Biosyn. Biosyn was still as reckless as ever, and other American companies were hurrying to set up facilities in foreign countries that lacked sophistication about genetic research. Countries that perceived genetic engineering to be like any other high-tech development, and thus welcomed it to their lands, unaware of the dangers posed. So that's why we began our investigation of InGen, Morris said, about 3 weeks ago. And what have you actually found? Grant said. Not much, Morris admitted. When I go back to San Francisco, we'll probably have to close the investigation. And I think I'm about finished here. He started packing up his briefcase. By the way, what does juvenile hyperspace mean? That's just a fancy label for my report, Grant said. Hyperspace is a term for multi-dimensional space, like three-dimensional tic-tac-toe. If you were to take all the behaviors of an animal in its eating and movements and sleeping, you could plot the animal within the multi-dimensional space. Some paleontologists refer to the behavior of an animal as occurring in an ecological hyperspace. Juvenile hyperspace would just refer to the behavior of juvenile dinosaurs. If you wanted to be as pretentious as possible, at the far end of the trailer the phone rang. Ellie answered it. She said, "He's in the meeting right now. Can he call you back?" Morris snapped his briefcase shut and stood. "Thanks for your help and the bear," he said. "No problem," Grant said. Grant walked with Morris down the trailer to the door at the far end. Morris said, "Did Hammond ever ask for any physical materials from your site? Bones or eggs or anything like that?" "No," Grant said. "Dr. Sattler mentioned you do some genetic work here." "Well, not exactly," Grant said. When we remove fossils that are broken or for some other reasons not suitable for museum preservation, we send the bones out to a lab that grinds them up and tries to extract proteins for us. The proteins are then identified and the report is sent back to us." "Which lab is that?" Morris asked. "Medical Biologic Services in Salt Lake." "How do you choose them?" "Competitive bids." "The lab has nothing to do with InGen?" Morris asked. Not that I know, Grant said. They came to the door of the trailer. Grant opened it and felt the rush of hot air from outside. Morris paused to put on his sunglasses. One last thing, Morris said. Suppose InGen wasn't really making a museum exhibit. Is there anything else they could have done with the information in the report you gave them? Grant laughed. Sure. They could feed a baby hadrosaur. Morris laughed too. A baby hadrosaur? That'd be something to see. How big were they? About so, Grant said, holding his hands 6 inches apart. Squirrel size. And how long before they became full grown? 3 years, Grant said, give or take. Morris held out his hand. Well, thanks again for your help. Take it easy driving back, Grant said. He watched for a moment as Morris walked back toward his car, and then closed the trailer door. Grant said, What did you think? Ellie shrugged, naive. You like the part where John Hammond is the evil arch-villain? Grant laughed. John Hammond's about as sinister as Walt Disney. By the way, who called? Oh, Ellie said. It was a woman named Alice Levine. She works at Columbia Medical Center. You know her? Grant shook his head. No. Well, it was something about identifying some remains. She wants you to call her back right away. Skeleton. Ellie Sattler brushed a strand of blonde hair back from her face and turned her attention to the acid baths. She had 6 in a row at molar strengths from 5 to 30%. She had to keep an eye on the stronger solutions because they would eat through the limestone and begin to erode the bones. And infant dinosaur bones were so fragile, she marveled that they had been preserved at all after 80 million years. She listened idly as Grant said, Miss Levine, this is Alan Grant. What's this about you have what? A what? He began to laugh. Oh, I doubt that very much, Miss Levine. No, I really don't have time. I'm sorry. Well, I'd take a look at it, but I can pretty much guarantee it's a basilisk lizard. But yes, you can do that. All right, send it now. Grant hung up and shook his head. These people. Ellie said, What's it about? Some lizard she's trying to identify. Grant said, She's going to fax me an X-ray. He walked over to the fax and waited as the transmission came through. Incidentally, I've got a new find for you. A good one. Yes. Grant nodded. Found it just before the kids showed up. On South Hill Horizon 4. Infant velociraptor jaw and complete dentition. So there's no question about identity. And the site looks undisturbed. We might even get a full skeleton. That's fantastic, Ellie said. How young? Young, Grant said. 2, maybe 4 months at most. And it's definitely a velociraptor? Definitely. Grant said, maybe our luck has finally turned. For the last 2 years at Snakewater, the team had excavated only duck-billed hadrosaurs. They already had evidence for vast herds of these grazing dinosaurs roaming the Cretaceous plains in groups of 10 or 20,000 as buffalo would later roam. But increasingly, the question that faced them was, where were the predators? They expected predators to be rare, of course. Studies of predator prey populations in the game parks of Africa and India suggested that, roughly speaking, there was one predatory carnivore for every 400 herbivores. That meant a herd of 10,000 duckbills would support only 25 tyrannosaurs. So it was unlikely that they would find the remains of a large predator. But where were the smaller predators? Snakewater had dozens of nesting sites. In some places, the ground was literally covered with fragments of dinosaur egg shells, and many small dinosaurs ate eggs. Animals like Dromaeosaurus, Oviraptor, Velociraptor, and Coelurus, predators 3 to 6 feet tall, must have been found here in abundance, but they had discovered none so far. Perhaps this Velociraptor skeleton did mean their luck had changed, and an infant Ellie knew that one of Grant's dreams was to study infant rearing behavior in carnivorous dinosaurs, as he had already studied the behavior of herbivores. Perhaps this was the first step towards that dream. "You must be pretty excited," Ellie said. Grant didn't answer. "I said you must be excited," Ellie repeated. "My God," Grant said. He was staring at the facts. Ellie looked over Grant's shoulder at the X-ray and breathed out slowly. "You think it's an Amazicus?" "Yes," Grant said. "Or Triassicus." "The skeleton is so light. But it's no lizard," she said. "No," Grant said. "This is not a lizard. No three-toed lizard has walked on this planet for 200 million years." Ellie's first thought was that she was looking at a hoax, an ingenious, skillful hoax, but a hoax nonetheless. Every biologist knew that the threat of a hoax was omnipresent. The most famous hoax, the Piltdown Man, had gone undetected for 40 years, and its perpetrator was still unknown. More recently, the distinguished astronomer Fred Hoyle had claimed that a fossil winged dinosaur, Archaeopteryx, on display in the British Museum, was a fraud. It was later shown to be genuine. The essence of a successful hoax was that it presented scientists with what they expected to see, and to Ellie's eyes, the X-ray image of the lizard was exactly correct. The three-toed foot was well balanced, with the medial claw smallest. The bony remnants of the fourth and fifth toes were located up near the metatarsal joint. The tibia was strong and considerably longer than the femur. At the hip, the acetabulum was complete. The tail showed 45 vertebrae. It was a young Procompsognathus. Could this X-ray be faked? "I don't know," Grant said, "but it's almost impossible to fake an X-ray." And Procompsognathus Procompsognathus is an obscure animal. Even people familiar with dinosaurs have never heard of it. Ellie read the note. Specimen acquired on the beach of Cabo Blanco, July 16. Apparently, a howler monkey was eating the animal. And this was all that was recovered. Oh, and it says the lizard attacked a little girl. I doubt that, Grant said. But perhaps Procompsognathus was so small and light, we assume it must be a scavenger, only feeding off dead creatures. And you can tell the size. He measured quickly. It's about 20 centimeters to the hips, which means the full animal would be about a foot tall, about as big as a chicken. Even a child would look pretty fearsome to it. It might bite an infant, but not a child. And he frowned at the X-ray image. You think this could really be a legitimate rediscovery? She said. Like the coelacanth? Maybe, Grant said. The coelacanth was a 5-foot-long fish, thought to have died out 65 million years ago, until a specimen was pulled from the ocean in 1938. But there were other examples. The Australian mountain pygmy possum was known only from fossils until a live one was found in a garbage can in Melbourne. And a 10,000-year-old fossil fruit bat from New Guinea was described by a zoologist who not long afterward received a living specimen in the mail. But could it be real? She persisted. What about the age? Grant nodded. The age is a problem. Most rediscovered animals were rather recent additions to the fossil record, 10 or 20,000 years old. Some were a few million years old. In the case of the coelacanth, 65 million years old. But the specimen they were looking at was much, much older than that. Dinosaurs had died out in the Cretaceous period 65 million years ago. They had flourished as the dominant life form on the planet in the Jurassic 190 million years ago. And they had first appeared in the Triassic roughly 220 million years ago. It was during the early Triassic period that Procompsognathus has lived, a time so distant that our planet didn't even look the same. All the continents were joined together in a single landmass called Pangaea, which extended from the north to the South Pole, a vast continent of ferns and forests with a few large deserts. The Atlantic Ocean was a narrow lake between what would become Africa and Florida. The air was denser, the land was warmer, there were hundreds of active volcanoes, and it was in this environment that Procompsognathus lived. Well, Ellie said, we know animals have survived. Crocodiles are basically Triassic animals living in the present. Sharks are Triassic, so we know it has happened before. Grant nodded. And the thing is, he said, how else do we explain it? It's either a fake, which I doubt, or else it's a rediscovery. What else could it be? The phone rang. Alice Levine again, Grant said. Let's see if she'll send us the actual specimen, he answered. And looked at Ellie's, and he answered it and looked at Ellie, surprised. Yes, I'll hold for Mr. Hammond. Yes, of course. Hammond? What does he want? Ellie said. Grant shook his head. And then he said into the phone, Yes, Mr. Hammond, yes. Is it good to hear your voice, too? Yes. He looked at Ellie. Oh, you did? Oh, yes, is that right? He cupped his hands over the microphone. He cupped his hands over the mouthpiece and said, Still as eccentric as ever. You've got to hear this. Grant pushed the speaker button and Ellie heard a raspy old man's voice speaking rapidly. Of an annoyance from some EPA fellow. Seems to have gone off half-cocked all on his own. Running around the country talking to people, stirring up things. I don't suppose anybody's come to see you way out there. As a matter of fact, Grant said, somebody did come to see me. Hammond snorted. I was afraid of that. Smart-ass kid named Morris. Yes, his name was Morris, Grant said. He's going to see all our consultants, Hammond said. He went to see Ian Malcolm the other day. You know the mathematician in Texas? That's the first I knew of it. We're having one hell of a time getting a handle on things. It's typical of the way government operates. There isn't any complaint. There isn't any charge. Just harassment from some kid who's unsupervised and is running around at the taxpayer's expenses. Did he bother you? Disrupt your work? No, he didn't bother me. Well, that's too bad, in a way, Hammond said, because I'd try to get an injunction to stop him if he had. As it is, I had our lawyers call over at EPA to find out what the hell their problem is. The head of the office claims he didn't know there was any investigation. You figured that one out. Damn bureaucracy is all it is. Hell, I think this kid's trying to get down to Costa Rica. Poke around, get onto our island. You know, we have an island down there. No, Grant said, looking at Ellie. I didn't know. Oh yes, we bought it and started our operation 4 or 5 years ago now. I forgot exactly, called Isla Nublar. Big island, 100 miles offshore, going to be a biological reserve. Wonderful place, tropical jungle. You know, you ought to see it, Dr. Grant. Sounds interesting, Grant said, but actually, it's almost finished now. You know, Hammond said, I've sent you some material about it. Did you get my material? No. But we're pretty far from maybe it'll come today. Look it over. The island's just beautiful. It's got everything. We've been in construction now 30 months. You can imagine, big park opens in September next year. You really ought to see it. It sounds wonderful, but as a matter of fact, Hammond said, I'm going to insist you see it, Dr. Grant. I know you'd find it right up your alley. You'd find it fascinating. I'm in the middle of, Grant said. Say, I'll tell you what, Hammond said, as if the idea had just occurred to him. I'm having some of the people who consulted for us go down there this weekend. Spend a few days and look it over. At our expenses, of course. It'd be terrific if you'd give us your opinion. I couldn't possibly, Grant said. Oh, just for a weekend, Hammond said, with the irritating cherry persistence of an old man. That's all I'm talking about, Dr. Grant. I wouldn't want to interrupt your work. I know how important that work is. Believe me, I know that. Never interrupt your work. But you could hop down there this weekend and be back on Monday. No, I couldn't, Grant said. I've just found a new skeleton and, yes, fine, but I still think you should come, Hammond said, not really listening. And we just received some evidence for a very puzzling and remarkable find, which seems to be a living proconsinatid. A what? Hammond said, slowing down. I didn't quite get that. You said a living proconsinatid? That's right, Grant said. It's a biological specimen, a partial fragment of an animal collected from Central America, a living animal. You don't say, Hammond said. A living animal. How extraordinary. Yes, Grant said. We think so too. So you see, this isn't the time for me to be leaving. Central America, did you say? Yes. Where in Central America is it from? Do you know? A beach called Cabo Blanco? I don't know exactly where. I see, Hammond cleared his throat. And when did this, specimen arrive in your hands? Just today. Today, I see. Today, I see. Yes. Hammond cleared his throat again. Grant looked at Ellie and mouthed, What's going on? Ellie shook her head. Sounds upset. Grant mouthed, See if Morse is still here. She went to the window and looked out. But Morse's car was gone. She turned back. On the speaker, Hammond coughed. Ah, Dr. Grant. Have you told anybody about it yet? No. Good. That's good. Well, yes, I'll tell you frankly, Dr. Grant. I'm having a little problem about this island. This EPA thing is coming at just the wrong time. How's that? Grant said. Well, we've had our problems and some delays. Let's just say that I'm under a little pressure here, and I'd like you to look at this island for me. Give me your opinion. I'll be paying you the usual weekend consultant rate of 20,000 a day. That'd be 60,000 for 3 days. And if you can spare Dr. Sattler, she'll go at the same rate. We need a botanist. What do you say? Ellie looked at Grant as he said, Well, Mr. Hammond, that much money could fully finance our expeditions for the next 2 summers. Good, good, Hammond said blindly. He seems distracted. Now his thoughts elsewhere. I want this to be easy. Now I'm sending the corporate jet to pick you up at the private airfield east of Chateau. You know the one I mean. It's only about 2 hours drive from where you are. You'll be there at 5 p.m. tomorrow, and I'll be waiting for you. Take you right down. Can you and Dr. Sattler make that plane? I guess we can. Good. Pack lightly. You don't need passports. I'm looking forward to it. See you tomorrow, Hammond said, and he hung up. Cohen, Strain, and Ross. Midday sun streamed into the San Francisco law offices of Cohen, Strain, and Ross, giving the room a cheerfulness that Donald Gennaro did not feel. He listened on the phone and looked at his boss. Daniel Ross, cold as an undertaker, in his dark pinstripe suit. I understand, John, Gennaro said. And Grant agreed to come? Good, yes. That sounds fine to me. My congratulations, John. He hung up the phone and turned to us. We can't trust Hammond anymore. He's under too much pressure. The EPA is investigating him. He's behind schedule on his Costa Rican resort, and the investors are getting nervous. There have been too many rumors of problems down there. Too many workmen have died. And now this business about a living procomposite whatever on the mainland. What does that mean? Ross said. Maybe nothing, Gennaro said. But Hamachi is one of our principal investors. I got a report last week from Hamachi's representative in San Jose, the capital of Costa Rica. According to the report, some new kind of lizard is biting children on the coast. Ross blinked. New lizard? Yes, Gennaro said. We can't screw around with this. We've got to inspect that island right away. I've asked Hammond to arrange independent site inspections every week for the next 3 weeks. And what does Hammond say? He insists nothing is wrong on the island, claims he has all these security precautions. But you don't believe him, Ross said. No, Gennaro said. I don't. Donald Gennaro's had come to Cohen straying from a background in investment banking. Cohen Strain's high-tech clients frequently needed capitalization, and Gennaro helped them find the money. One of his first assignments back in 1982 had been to accompany John Hammond's while the old man, then nearly 70, put together the funding to start the Engine Corporation. They eventually raised almost $1 billion, and Gennaro remembered it as a wild ride. Hammond's a dreamer, Gennaro said. A potentially dangerous dreamer, Ross said. We should never have gotten involved. What is our financial position? The firm, Gennaro said, owns 5%. General or limited? General. Ross shook his head. We should never have done that. It seemed wise at the time, Gennaro said. Hell, it was 8 years ago. We took it in lieu of some fees. And if you remember, Hammond's plan was extremely speculative. He was really pushing the envelope. Nobody's really thought he could pull it off. But apparently he has, Ross said. In any case, I agree that an inspection is overdue. What about your site experts? I'm starting with experts. It's Hammond already hired as consultants early in the project. Gennaro tossed a list onto Ross's desk. First group is a paleontologist, a paleobotanist, and a mathematician. They go down this weekend. I'll go with them. Will they tell you the truth? Ross said. I think so. None of them had much to do with the island, and one of them, the mathematician Ian Malcolm, was openly hostile to the project from the start. Insisted it would never work. Could never work. And who else? Just a technical person, the computer system analyst, review the park's computers, and fix some bugs. He should be there by Friday morning. Fine, Ross said. You're making the arrangements. Hammond asked to place the calls himself. I think he wants to pretend that he's not in trouble, that it's just a social invitation, showing off his island. All right, Ross said, but just make sure it happens. Stay on top of it. I want this Costa Rican situation resolved within a week. Ross got up and walked out of the room. Gennaro dialed heard the running hiss of a radio phone. Then he heard a voice said, Grant here. Hi, Dr. Grant. This is Donald Gennaro. I'm the General Counsel for InGen. We talked a few years back. I don't know if you remember. I remember, Grant said. Well, Gennaro said, I just got off the phone with John Hammond, who tells me the good news. That you're coming down to our island in Costa Rica. Yes, Grant said. I guess we are going down there tomorrow. Well, I just want to extend my thanks to you for doing this on short notice. Everybody at InGen appreciates it. We've asked Ian Malcolm, who like you was one of the early consultants, to come down as well. He's the mathematician at UT in Austin. John Hammond mentioned that, Grant said. Well, good, Gennaro said. And I will be coming too, as a matter of fact. By the way, this specimen you have found of a Procom, what is it? Procomsognathus, Grant said. Yes, do you have the specimen with you, Dr. Grit? The actual specimen. No, Grant said. I've only seen an X-ray. The specimen is in New York. A woman from Columbia University called me. Well, I wonder if you could give me the details on that, Gennaro said. Then I can run down that specimen for Mr. Hammond, who's very excited about it. I'm sure you want to see the actual specimen too, perhaps. I can even get it delivered to the island while you're all down there, Gennaro said. Grant gave him the information. Well, that's fine, Dr. Grant, Gennaro said. My regards to Dr. Sattler. I look forward to meeting you and him tomorrow. And Gennaro hung up. Plans. This just came, Ellie said the next day, walking to the back of the trailer with a thick manila envelope. One of the kids brought it back from town. It's from Hammond. Grant noticed the blue and white InGen logo as he tore open the envelope. Inside there was no cover letter, just a bound stack of paper. Pulling it out, he discovered it was a blueprint. They were reduced from a thick book. The cover was marked Isla Nublar, Resort Guest Facilities, Full Set Safari Lodge. What the hell is this? He said. As he flipped open the book, a sheet of paper fell out. Dear Alan and Ellie, as you can imagine, we don't have much in the way of formal promotional materials yet, but this should give you some idea of the Isla Nublar project. I think it's very exciting. Looking forward to discuss this with you. Hope you can join us. Regards, John. I don't get it, Grant said. He flipped through the sheets. These are architectural plans. He turned to the top sheet. Vista Center Lodge, Isla Nublar Resort. Client, InGen Inc., Palo Alto, California. Architects, Dunning, Murphy and Associates, New York, Richard Murphy. Designer partner, Theodore Chen, senior designer, Sheldon James, administrative partner, engineers, Harlow, Whitney and Fields, Boston, structural AT, Misakawa, Osaka, mechanical, landscaping, Shepperton, Rogers, London, Ashikika H. Ayasu, Kanazawa, electrical, N.V. Kobayashi, Tokyo A.R. Makasawa, Senior Consultant, Computer CC, Integrated Computer System Inc., Cambridge, Mass. Dennis Nedry, Project Supervisor. Grant turned to the plans themselves. They were stamped industrial secrets, do not copy, and confidential work product, not for distribution. Each seat was numbered, and at the top, these plans represent the confidential creations of InGen Inc. You must have signed document 112.4a, or you risk prosecution. Looks pretty paranoid to me, he said. Maybe there's a reason, Ellie said. The next page was a topographical map. It showed Isola Nubla as an inverted teardrop, bulging at the north, tapering at the south. The island was 8 miles long, and the map divided it into several large sections. The northern section was marked Visitor Area, and it contained structures marked Visitor Arrivals, Visitor Center Administration, Power Desalinization Support, Hammond Res, and Safari Lodge. Grant could see the outline of a swimming pool, the rectangles of tennis courts, and the round squiggles that represented planting and shrubbery. Looks like a resort, all right, Ellie said. There followed detail sheets for the Safari Lodge itself. In the elevation sketches, the lodge looked dramatic. A long, low building with a series of pyramid shapes on the roof. But there was little about the other buildings in the visitor area. And the rest of the island was even more mysterious. As far as Grant could tell, it was mostly open space, a network of roads, tunnels, and outlying buildings, and a long, thin lake that appeared to be man-made, with concrete dams and barriers. But for the most part, the island was divided into big curving areas with very little development at all. Each area was marked by codes. P Proc V2A, D Trick L5, 4A plus 1, Ln Othen C43A plus 1, and VV Hadry X1, 6A plus 3 dB. Is there an explanation for the codes? She said. Grant flipped the pages rapidly, but he couldn't find one. Maybe they took it out, she said. I'm telling you, Grant said. Paranoid. He looked at the big curving divisions separated from one another by the network of roads. There were only 6 divisions on the whole island, and each division was separated from the road by a concrete moat. Outside each moat was a fence, with a little lightning sign alongside it. That's mystified them until they were finally able to figure out it meant the fences were electrified. That's odd, she said. Electrified fences at a resort? Miles of them, Grant said. Electrified fences and moats. Together, and usually with a road alongside them as well. Just like a zoo, Ellie said. They went back to the topographical map and looked closely at the contour lines. The roads had been placed oddly. The main road ran north-south right through the central hills of the island, including one section of road that seemed to be literally cut into the side of a cliff above a river. It began to look as if there had been a deliberate effort to leave these open areas as big enclosures, separated from the roads by moats and electric fences, and the roads were raised up above the ground level, so you could see over the fences. You know, Ellie said, some of these dimensions are enormous. Look at this. This concrete moat is 30 feet wide. That's like a military fortification. So are these buildings, Grant said. He had noticed that each open division had a few buildings, usually located in out-of-the-way corners. But the buildings were all concrete, with thick walls inside view elevations. They look like concrete bunkers with small windows like the Nazi pillboxes from old war movies. At the moment, they heard a muffled explosion, and Grant put the papers aside. Back to work, he said. Fire! There was a slight vibration, and then yellow contour lines traced across the computer screen. This time, the resolution was perfect, and Alan Grant had a glimpse of the skeleton, beautifully defined. The long neck arched back. It was unquestionably an infant velociraptor, and it looked imperfect. The screen went blank. I hate computers, Grant said, squinting in the sun. What happened now? Lost the integrator input, one of the kids said. Just a minute. The kid bent to look at the tangle of wires going into the back of the battery-powered portable computer. They had set the computer up on a bear cotton on top of the hill 4, not far from the device they called Thumper. Grant sat down on the side of the hill and looked at his watch. He said to Ellie, "We're going to have to do this the old-fashioned way." One of the kids overheard. "Aw, Alan." "Look," Grant said, "I've got a plane to catch, and I want the fossils protected before I go. Once you begin to expose a fossil, you had to continue or risk losing it." Visitors imagined the landscape of the Badlands to be unchanging, but in fact it was continuously eroding, literally right before your eyes. All day long you could hear the clatter of pebbles rolling down the crumbling hillside, and there was always the risk of a rainstorm. Even a brief shower would wash away a delicate fossil. Thus, Grant's partially exposed skeleton was at risk, and it had to be protected until he returned. Fossil protection ordinarily consisted of a tarp over the site and a trench around the perimeter to control water runoffs. The question was how large a trench the velociraptor fossil required. To decide that, they were using computer-assisted sonic tomography, or CAST. This was a new procedure in which Thumper fired a soft lead slug into the ground. setting up shockwaves that were read by the computer and assembled into a kind of X-ray image of the hillside. They had been using it all summer with varying results. Thumper was 20 feet away now, a big silver box on wheels, with an umbrella on top. It looked like an ice cream vendor's push cart, parked incongruously on the Badlands. Thumper had two youthful attendants loading the next soft lead pellet. So far the cast program merely located the extent of finds, helping Grant's team to dig more efficiently, but the kids claimed that within a few years it would be possible to generate an image so detailed that excavation would be redundant. You could get a perfect image of the bones in 3 dimensions, and it promised a whole new era of archaeology without excavation. But none of that had happened yet, and the equipment that worked flawlessly in the university laboratory proved pitifully delicate and fickle in the field. How much longer? Grant said. We got it now, Alan. It's not bad. Grant went to look at the computer screen. He saw the complete skeleton, traced in bright yellow. It was indeed a young specimen, the outstanding characteristic of Velociraptor. The single-toed claw, which in a full-grown animal was a curved 6-inch-long weapon, capable of ripping open its prey, was in this infant no larger than the thorn on a rose bush. It was hardly visible at all on the screen, and Velociraptor was a lightly built dinosaur. In any case, an animal as fine-boned as a bird, and presumably as intelligent. Here the skeleton appeared in perfect order, except the head and neck were bent back towards the posterior. Such neck flexion was so common in fossils that some scientists had formulated a theory to explain it, suggesting that the dinosaurs had become extinct because they had been poisoned by the evolving alkaloids in plants. The twisted neck was thought to signify the death agony of the dinosaurs. Grant had finally put that one to rest by demonstrating that many species of birds and reptiles underwent a post-mortem contraction of posterior neck ligaments, which bent the head backward in a characteristic way. It had nothing to do with the cause of death. It had to do with the way a carcass dried in the sun. Grant saw that this particular skeleton had also been twisted laterally, so that the right leg and foot were raised up above the backbone. It looks kind of distorted, one of the kids said. But I don't think it's the computer. No, Grant said. It's just time. Lots and lots of time. Grant knew that people could not imagine geological time. Human life was lived on another scale of time entirely. An apple turned brown in a few minutes. Silverware turned black in a few days. A compost heap decayed in a season. A child grew up in a decade. None of these everyday human experiences prepared people to be able to imagine the meaning of 80 million years. the length of time that had passed since this little animal had died. In the classroom, Grant had tried different comparisons. If you imagined the human lifespan of 60 years was compressed to a day, then 80 million years would still be 3,652 years, older than the pyramids. The velociraptor had been dead a long time. Doesn't look very fearsome, one of the kids said. He wasn't, Grant said. At least, not until he grew up. Probably this baby has scavenged, feeding off carcasses slain by the adults. After the big animals had gorged themselves and lay basking in the sun, carnivores could eat as much as 25% of their body weight in a single meal, and it made them sleepy. Afterward, the babies would chitter and scrambled over the indulgent, somnolent bodies of the adults, and nipped little bites from the dead animal. The babies were probably cute little animals, but an adult velociraptor was another matter entirely. Pound for pound, a velociraptor was the most rapacious dinosaurs that ever lived. Although relatively small, about 200 pounds, the size of a leopard, velociraptors were quick, intelligent, and vicious, able to attack with sharp jaws and powerful clawed forearms and a devastating single claw on the foot. Velociraptors hunted in packs, and Grant thought it must have been a sight to see a dozen of these animals racing at full speed, leaping onto the back of a much larger dinosaur, tearing at the neck and slashing at the ribs and belly. "We're running out of time," Ellie said, bringing him back. Grant gave instructions for the trench from the computer image. They knew the skeleton lay in a relatively confined area. A ditch around a 2-meter square would be sufficient. Meanwhile, Ellie lashed down the top that covered the side of the hill. Grant helped her pound in the final stakes. "How did the baby die?" one of the kids asked. "I doubt we'll know," Grant replied. "Infant mortality in the wild is high. In African parks, it runs 70% among some carnivores. It could have been anything: disease, separation from the group, anything, or even attack by an adult. We know these animals hunted in packs, but we don't know anything about their social behavior in a group." The students nodded. They had all studied animal behavior, and they knew, for example, that when a new male took over a lion's pride, the first thing he did was kill all the cubs. The reason was apparently genetic. The male had evolved to disseminate his genes as widely as possible, and by killing the cubs he brought all the females into heat so that he could impregnate them, and also prevented the females from wasting their time nurturing the offspring of another male. Perhaps the velociraptor hunting pack was also ruled by a dominant male. They know so little about dinosaurs, Grant thought. After 150 years of research and excavation all around the world, they still knew almost nothing about what the dinosaurs had really been like. "We've got to go," Ellie said, "if we are going to go to Chateau by 5. Hammond. Janelle secretly bustled in with a new suitcase It still had the sales tags on it. "You know, Mr. Gennaro," she said severely, "when you forgot to pack, it makes me think you don't really want to go on this trip." "Maybe you're right," Gennaro said. "I'm missing my kid's birthday." Saturday was Amanda's birthday, and Elizabeth had invited 20 screaming 4-year-olds to share it, as well as Cappy the Clown and a magician. His wife hadn't been happy to hear that Gennaro was going out of town. Neither had Amanda. "Well, I did the best I could on short notice," his secretary said. There's running shoes your size, and khaki shorts and shirts, and a shaving kit, a pair of jeans, and a sweatshirt if it gets cold. The car is downstairs to take you to the airport. You have to leave now to make the flight." She left. Gennaro walked down the hallway, tearing the sales tags off the suitcase. As he passed the all-glass conference room, Dan Ross left the table and came outside. "Have a good trip," Ross said. "But let's be very clear about one thing. I don't know how bad this situation actually is, Donald, but if there's a problem on that island, burn it to the ground." "Jesus, Dan, we're talking about a big investment. Don't hesitate. Don't think about it. Just do it. Hear me?" Gennaro nodded. "I hear you," he said. "But Hammond—" "Screw Hammond," Ross said. My boy, the familiar raspy voice said. "How have you been, my boy?" "Very well, sir," Gennaro replied. He leaned back in the padded leather chair of the Gulfstream II jet as it flew east toward the Rocky Mountains. "You'll never call me any more," Hammond said reproachfully. "I've missed you, Donald. How's your lovely wife?" "She's fine. Elizabeth's fine. We have a little girl now." "Wonderful, wonderful. Children are such a delight. She'd get a kick out of our new park in Costa Rica." Gennaro had forgotten how short Hammond was as he sat in the chair. His feet didn't touch the carpeting. He swung his legs as he talked. There was a childlike quality to the man, even though Hammond must now be, 75, 76, something like that. He looked older than Gennaro remembered, but then Gennaro hadn't seen him for almost 5 years. Hammond was flamboyant, a born showman, and back in 1983 he had an elephant that he carried around with him in a little cage. The elephant was 9 inches high and a foot long, and perfectly formed, except his tusks were stunted. Hammond took the elephant with him to fundraising meetings. Gennaro usually carried it into the room, the cage covered with a little blanket like a tea cozy, and Hammond would give his usual speech about the prospects for developing what he called consumer biologicals. Then at the dramatic moment, Hammond would rip away the blanket to reveal the elephant, and he would ask for money. The elephant was always a rousing success. Its tiny body hardly bigger than a cat's, promised untold wonders to come from the laboratory of Norman Atherton, the Stanford geneticist who was Hammond's partner in the new venture. But as Hammond talked about the elephant, he left a great deal unsaid. For example, Hammond was starting a genetics company, but the tiny elephant hadn't been made by a genetic procedure. Atherton had simply taken a dwarf elephant embryo and raised it in an artificial womb with hormonal modification. That in itself was quite the achievement, but nothing like what Hammond hinted had been done. Also, Atherton hadn't been able to duplicate his miniature elephant, and he tried. For one thing, everybody who saw the elephant wanted one. Then, too, the elephant was prone to colds, particularly during winter. The sneezes coming through the little trunk filled Hammond with dread, and sometimes the elephant would get his tusk stuck between the bars of the cage and snort irritably as he tried to get free. Sometimes he got infections around the tusk line. Hammond always feared that his elephant would die before Atherton could grow a replacement. Hammond also concealed from prospective investors that the fact that the elephant's behavior had changed substantially in the process of miniaturization. The little creature might look like an elephant, but he acted like a vicious rodent, quick-moving and mean-tempered. Hammond discouraged people from petting the elephant to avoid nipped fingers. And although Hammond spoke confidently of $7 billion in annual revenues by 1993, his project was intensely speculative. Hammond had visions and enthusiasm, but there was no certainty that his plan would work at all, particularly since Norman Atherton, the brains behind the project, had terminal cancer, which was a final point Hammond neglected to mention. Even so, with Gennaro's help, Hammond got his money between September of 1983 and November of 1985. John Alfred Hammond and his pachyderm portfolio raised $870 million in venture capital to finance his proposed corporation, International Genetic Technologies, Inc. And they could have raised more, except Hammond insisted on absolute secrecy, and he offered no return on capital for at least 5 years. That scared a lot of investors off. In the end, they'd had to take mostly Japanese consortia. The Japanese were the only investors who had the patience. Sitting in the leather chair of the jet, Gennaro thought about how evasive Hammond was. The old man was now ignoring the fact that Gennaro's law firm had forced this trip on him. Instead, Hammond behaved as if they were engaged in a purely social outing. "It's too bad you didn't bring your family with you, Donald," he said. Gennaro shrugged. "It's my daughter's birthday. 20 kids already scheduled. The cake and the clown, you know how it is." "Oh, I understand," Hammond said. "Kids set their hearts on things. Anyway, is the park ready for visitors?" Gennaro asked. "Well, not officially," Hammond said, "but the hotel is built, so there is a place to stay." "And the animals?" "Of course the animals are all there, all in their spaces." Gennaro said, "I remember in the original proposal, you were hoping for a total of 12. Oh, we're far beyond that. We have 238 animals, Donald." 238? The old man giggled. Pleased at Gennaro's reaction. "You can't imagine it. We have herds of them." 238. How many species? 15 different species, Donald. That's incredible, Gennaro said. That's fantastic. And what about all the other things you wanted? The facilities, the computers? All of it, Hammond said. Everything on that island is state-of-the-art. You'll see for yourself, Donald. It's perfectly wonderful. That's why this concern is so misplaced. There's absolutely no problem with this island. Gennaro said, then there should be absolutely no problem with an inspection. And there isn't, Hammond said, but it slows things down. Everything has to stop for the official visit. You've had delays anyway. You've proposed the opening. Oh, that, Hammond tugged at the red silk handkerchief in the breast pocket of his sport coat. It was bound to happen. Why, Gennaro asked. Well, Donald, Hammond said, to explain that, you have to go back to the initial concept of the resort. The concept of the most advanced amusement park in the world, combining the latest electronic and biological technologies. I'm not talking about rides. Everybody has rides. Coney Island has rides. And these days, everybody has animatronic environments. The haunted house, the private den, the wild rest, the earthquake, everyone has those things. So we set out to make biological attractions, living attractions so astonishing they would capture the imagination of the entire world. Gennaro had to smile. It was almost the same speech, word for word, that he had used on the investors so many years ago. And we can never forget the ultimate object of the project in Costa Rica. To make money, Hammond said, staring out the window of the jet. Lots and lots of money, I remember, Gennaro said. And the secret to making money in a park, Hammond said, is to limit your personal costs. The food handlers, ticket takers, cleanup crews, repair teams, to make a park that runs with minimal staff. That was why we invested in all the computer technology. We automated wherever we could, I remember. But the plain fact is, Hammond said, when you put together all the animals and all the computer systems, you run into snags. Whoever got a major computer system up and running on schedule? Nobody I know. So you've just had a normal startup delays. Yes, that's right, Hammond said. Normal delays. I heard there were accidents during construction, Gennaro said. Some workmen died. Yes, there were several accidents, Hammond said, and a total of 3 deaths. 2 workers died building the cliff road. One other died as a result of an earth move accident in January. But we haven't had any accident for months now. He put his hand on the young woman's arm. Donald, he said, believe me when I tell you that everything on the island is going forward as planned. Everything on that island is perfectly fine. The intercom clicked. The pilot said, "Seat belts, please. We're landing in Chateau." Dry plains stretched away toward distant black buttes. The afternoon wind blew dust and tumbleweed across the cracked concrete. Grant stood with Ellie near the jeep and waited while the sleek Grumman jet circled for a landing. "I hate to wait on the money men," Grant grumbled. Ellie shrugged. "Goes with the job." Although many fields of science, such as physics and chemistry, had become federally funded, paleontology remained strongly dependent on private patrons. Quite apart from his own curiosity about the island in Costa Rica, Grant understood that if John Hammond asked for his help, he would give it. That was how patronage worked, how it had always worked. The little jet landed on and rolled quite quickly towards them. Ellie shouldered her bag. The jet came to a stop and a stewardess in a blue uniform opened the door. Inside he was surprised at how cramped it was. Despite the luxurious appointments, Grant had to hunch over as he went to shake Hammond's hand. Dr. Grant, Dr. Sattler, Hammond said, it's good of you to join us. Allow me to introduce my associate, Donald Gennaro. Gennaro was a stocky, muscular man in his mid-30s, wearing an Armani suit and wire-frame glasses. Grant disliked him on sight. He shook hands quickly. When Ellie shook his hands, Gennaro said in surprise, "You're a woman. These things happen," she said, and Grant thought she doesn't like him either. Hammond turned to Gennaro. "You know, of course, what Dr. Grant and Dr. Sattler do. They are paleontologists. They dig up dinosaurs." And then he began to laugh, as if he found the idea very funny. "Take your seats, please," the stewardess said, closing the door. Immediately, the plane began to move. "You'll have to excuse us," Hammond said, "but we are in a bit of a rush. Donald thinks it's important we get right down there." The pilot announced 4 hours flying time to Dallas, where they would refuel and then go on to Costa Rica, arriving the following morning. And how long will we be in Costa Rica? Grant asked. "Well, that really depends," Gennaro said. "We have a few things to clear up. Take my word for it," Hammond said, turning to Grant. "We'll be down there no more than 48 hours. Grant buckled his seatbelt. "This island of yours that we are going to, I haven't heard anything about it before. Is it some kind of resort? Is it some kind of secret?" "In a way," Hammond said. "We have been very, very careful about making sure nobody knows about it, until the day we finally opened that island to the surprised and delighted public." Target of opportunity. The Byerson Corporations of Cupertino, California, had never called an emergency meeting of its board of directors. The 10 directors, now sitting in the conference room, were irritable and impatient. It was 8 p.m. They had been talking among themselves for the last 10 minutes, but slowly had fallen silent, shuffling papers, looking pointedly at their watches. What are we waiting for?" one asked. "One more," Louis Dodson said. "We need one more." He glanced at his watch. One mayor's office had said he was coming. Up on the 6 o'clock plane from San Diego. He should be here by now, even allowing for traffic from the airport. "You need a quorum?" another director asked. "Yes," Dodson said. "We do." That shut them up for a moment. A quorum meant that they were going to be asked to make an important decision, and God knows that they were. Although Dodson would have preferred not to call a meeting at all. But Steingarten, the head of Byerson, was adamant. "You'll have to get their agreement for this one, Lou," he had said. Depending on who you talk to, Louis Dodson was famous as the most aggressive geneticist of his generation, or the most reckless 34, balding, hawk-faced, and intense. He had been dismissed by Johns Hopkins as a graduate student for planning gene therapy on human patients without obtaining the proper FDA protocols. Hired by Biosin, he had conducted the controversial rabies vaccine test in Chile. Now he was the head of the product development at Biosin, which supposedly consisted of reverse engineering, taking a competitor's products, tearing it apart, learning how it worked, and then making your own version. In practice, it involved industrial espionage, much of it directed toward the InGen Corporation. In the 1980s, a few genetic engineering companies began to ask, what is the biological equivalent of a Sony Walkman? These companies weren't interested in pharmaceuticals or health. They were interested in entertainment, sports, leisure activities, cosmetics, and pets. The perceived demand for consumer biologicals in the 1990s was high. InGen and Biosin were both at work in this field. Biosin had already achieved some success, engineering a new pale trout under contract to the Department of Fish and Game of the state of Idaho. This trout was easier to spot in streams, and was said to represent a step forward in angling. At least it eliminated complaints to the Fish and Game Department that there were no trout in the streams. The fact that the pale trout sometimes died of sunburn, and that its flesh was soggy and tasteless, was not discussed. Biosin was still working on that, and the door opened and one male entered the room, slipped into a seat. Dodson now had his quorum. He immediately stood. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are here tonight to consider a target of opportunity InGen." Dodson quickly reviewed the background. InGen's startup in 1983 with Japanese investors, the purchase of 3 Cray XMPs supercomputers, the purchase of Isla Nublar in Costa Rica, the stockpiling of amber, the unusual donations to zoos around the world from the New York Zoological Society to the Wanthapa Wildlife Park in India. Despite all these clues, Dodson said, we still had no idea where InGen might be going. The company seemed obviously focused on animals, and they had hired researchers with an interest in the past, paleobiologists, DNA psychologists, and so on. Then in 1987, InGen bought an obscure company called Millipore Plastic Products in Nashville, Tennessee. This was an agribusiness company that had recently patented a new plastic with the characteristics of an avian eggshell. This plastic could be shaped into an egg and used to grow chick embryos. Starting the following year, InGen took the entire output of this Millipore plastic for its own use. Dr. Dodson, this is all very interesting. At the same time, Dodson continued, construction was begun on Isla Nublar. This involved massive earthworks, including a shallow lake 2 miles long in the center of the island. Plans for resort facilities were let out with a high degree of confidentiality, but it appears that InGen has built a private zoo of large dimensions on the island. One of the directors leaned forward and said, Dr. Dodgson, so what? It's not an ordinary zoo, Dodgson said. This zoo is a unique in the world. It seems that Ingen has done something quite extraordinary. They have managed to clone extinct animals from the past. What animals? Animals that hatched from eggs, and that require a lot of room in a zoo. What animals? Dinosaurs, Dodgson said. They are cloning dinosaurs. The consternation that followed was entirely misplaced, in Dodgson's view. The trouble with money men was that they didn't keep up. They had invested in a field, but they didn't know what was possible. In fact, there had been discussion of cloning dinosaurs in the technical literature as far back as 1982. With each passing year, the manipulation of DNA had grown easier. Genetic material had already been extracted from Egyptian mummies, and from the hide of a quagga, a zebra-like African animal. They had become extinct in the 1880s. By 1985, it seemed possible that quagga DNA might be reconstituted and a new animal grown. If so, it would be the first creature brought back from extinction solely by reconstruction of its DNA. If that was possible, what else was also possible? The mastodon, the saber-toothed tiger, the dodo, or even a dinosaur? Of course, no dinosaur DNA was known to exist anywhere in the world, but by grinding up large quantities of dinosaur bones, it might be possible to extract fragments of DNA. Formerly, it was thought that fossilization eliminated all DNA. Now that was recognized as untrue. If enough DNA fragments were recovered, it might be possible to clone a living animal. Back in 1982, the technical problems had seemed daunting, but there was no theoretical barrier. It was merely difficult, expensive, and unlikely to work. Yet it was certainly possible if anyone cared to try. Ingen had apparently decided to try. What they have done, Dodgson said, is build the greatest single tourist attraction in the history of the world. As you know, zoos are extremely popular. Last year, more Americans visited zoos than all professional baseball and football games combined. And the Japanese love zoos. There are 50 zoos in Japan and more being built. And for this zoo, Ingen can charge whatever they want. $2,000 a day, $10,000 a day. And then there is the merchandising. The picture books, t-shirts, video games, caps, stuffed toys, comic books, and pets. Pets? Of course. If Ingen can make full-size dinosaurs, they can also make pygmy dinosaurs as household pets. What child won't want a little dinosaur as a pet? A little patent animal for their very own. Ingen will sell millions of them, and then Ingen will engineer them so that these pet dinosaurs can only eat Ingen pet food. Jesus, somebody said. Exactly, Dodgson said. The zoo is the centerpiece of an enormous enterprise. You said these dinosaurs will be patented? Yes, genetically engineered animals can now be patented. The Supreme Court ruled on that in favor of Harvard in 1987. Engine will own its dinosaurs, and no one else can legally make them. What prevents us from creating our own dinosaurs? Someone said. Nothing, except that they have a 5-year start. It'll be almost impossible to catch up before the end of the century. He paused. Of course, if we could obtain examples of their dinosaurs, we could reverse engineer them and make our own, with enough modification in the DNA to evade their patents. Can we obtain examples of their dinosaurs? Jocelyn paused. I believe we can, yes. Somebody cleared his throat. There wouldn't be anything illegal about it. Oh no, Dodson said quickly. Nothing illegal. I'm talking about a legitimate source of their DNA. A disgruntled employee or some trash improperly disposed of, something like that. Do you have a legitimate source, Dr. Dawson? I do, Dawson said, but I'm afraid there is some urgency to the decision, because InGen is experiencing a small crisis, and my source will have to act within the next 24 hours. A long silence descended over the room. The men looked at the secretary, taking notes, and the tape recorder on the table in front of her. I don't see the need for a formal resolution on this, Dodson said. Just a sense of the room. As to whatever you feel I should proceed. Slowly the heads nodded. Nobody spoke. Nobody went on record. They just nodded silently. Thank you for coming, gentlemen, Judson said. I'll take it from here. Airport. Louis Dodson entered the coffee shop in the departure building of the San Francisco airport and looked around quickly. His man was already there, waiting at the counter. Dodson sat down next to him and placed the briefcase on the floor between them. You're late, pal, the man said. He looked at the straw hat Dodson was wearing and laughed. What is that supposed to be? A disguise? You never know, Dodson said, suppressing his anger. For 6 months, Dodson had patiently cultivated this man, who had grown more obnoxious and arrogant with each meeting. But there was nothing Dodson could do about that. Both men knew exactly what the stakes were. Bioengineered DNA was, weight for weight, the most valuable material in the world. A single microscopic bacterium too small to see with the naked eye, but containing the genes for a heart attack enzyme, streptokinase, or for ice minus, which prevented frost damage to crops, might be worth $5 billion to the right buyer. And that fact of life had created a bizarre new world of industrial espionage. Dodson was especially skilled at it. In 1987, he convinced a disgruntled geneticist to quit CETAS for Biosin and take five strains of engineered bacteria with her. The geneticist simply put a drop of each on the fingernails of one hand and walked out the door. But InGen presented a tougher challenge. Dawson wanted more than bacterial DNA. He wanted frozen embryos. And he knew InGen guarded its embryos with the most elaborate security measures to guarded it. To obtain them, he needed an engine employee who had access to the embryos, who was willing to steal them, and who could defeat the security. Such a person was not easy to find. Dodson had finally located a suspectable engine employee earlier in the year. Although this particular person had no access to genetic material, Dawson kept up the contact, meeting the man monthly at Carlos and Charlie's in Silicon Valley, helping him in small ways. And now that Engine was inviting contractors and advisors to visit the island, it was the moment that Dodson had been waiting for, because it meant this man would have access to embryos. "Let's get down to it," the man said. "I've got 10 minutes before my flight." "You want to go over it again?" Dodson said. "Hell no, Dr. Dodson," the man said. "I want to see the damn money." Dodson flipped the latch on the briefcase and opened it a few inches. The man glanced down casually. "That's all of it?" "That's half of it. $750,000. "Okay, fine." The man turned away, drank his coffee. "That's fine, Dr. Dodson." Dodson quickly locked the briefcase. "That's for all 15 species, you remember." "I remember 15 species, frozen embryos. And how am I going to transport them?" Dodson handed the man a large can of Gillette foamy shaving cream. That's it. They may check my luggage." Dodson shrugged. "Press the top," he said. The man pressed it, and white shaving cream puffed into his hand. "Not bad." He wiped the foam on the edge of his plate. "Not bad. The can's a little heavier than usual, it's all." Dawson's technical team had been assembling it around the clock for the last 2 days. Quickly, he showed him how it worked, how much coolant gas is inside, enough for 36 hours. The embryos have to be back in San Jose by then. "That's up to your guy in the boat," the man said. "Better make sure he has a portable cooler on board." "I'll do that," Dodson said. "And let's just review the bidding." "The deal is the same," Dodson said. 50,000 on delivery of each embryo. If they're viable, an additional 50,000 each." "That's fine. Just make sure you have the boat waiting at the east dock on the island of the island. Friday night, not the north dock, where the big supply boats arrive. The east dock, it's a small utility dock. You got that?" "I got it," Dodson said. "When will you be back in San Jose?" "Probably Sunday." The man pushed away from the counter. Dodson fretted. "You're sure you know how to work the—" "I know," the man said. "Believe me, I know." "Also," Dodson said, "we think the island maintains constant radio contact with Engine corporate headquarters in California, so—" "Look, I've got it covered," the man said. "Just relax and get the money ready. I want it all Sunday morning in San Jose Airport in cash. It'll be waiting for you," Dodson said. "Don't worry." Malcolm. Shortly before midnight, he stepped on the plane at the Dallas airport. A tall, thin, balding man of 35, dressed entirely in black. Black shirt, black trousers, black socks, black sneakers. "Oh, Dr. Malcolm," Hammond said, smiling with forced graciousness. Malcolm grinned. "Hello, John. Yes, I am afraid your old nemesis is here." Malcolm shook hands with everyone, saying quickly, And Malcolm, how do you do? I do, Mouse. He struck Grinch as being more amused by the outing than anything else. Certainly Grant recognized his name. Ian Malcolm was one of the most famous of the new generations of mathematicians who were openly interested in how the real world works. These scholars broke with the cloistered tradition of mathematics in several important ways. For one thing, they use computers constantly, a practice traditionally mathematicians frowned on. For another, they worked almost exclusively with non-linear equations in the emerging field called chaos theory. For a third, they appear to care that their mathematics describes something that actually existed in the real world. And finally, as if to emphasize their emergence from academia into the world, they dressed and spoke with what one senior mathematician called a deplorable excess of personality. In fact, they often behaved like rock stars. Malcolm sat in one of the padded chairs. The stewardess asked him if he wanted a drink. He said, "Diet Coke," shaking, not stirred. Humid Dallas air drifted through the open doors. Ellie said, "Isn't it a little warm for Black?" "You're extremely pretty, Dr. Sattler," he said. "I could look at your legs all day. But no, as a matter of fact, black is an excellent color for heat. If you remember your black body radiation, black is actually best in heat. Efficient radiation in any case. I will only two colors, black and gray." Ellie was staring at him, her mouth open. "These colors are appropriate for any occasion," Malcolm continued, "and they go well together. Should I mistakenly put on a pair of gray socks with my black trousers? But don't you find it boring to wear only two colors?" "Not at all. I find it liberating. I believe my life has value, and I don't want to waste it thinking about clothing," Malcolm said. "I don't want to think about what I will wear in the morning. Truly, can you imagine anything more boring than fashion? Professional sports, perhaps? Grown men swatting little balls while the rest of the world pays money to applaud. But on the whole, I find fashion even more tedious than sports." "Dr. Malcolm," Hammonds explained, "is the man of strong opinions, and mad as a hatter," Malcolm said cheerfully. "But you must admit, these are non-trivial issues. We live in a world of frightful givens. It is given that you will not behave like this, given that you will care about that. No one thinks about the givens. Isn't it amazing? In the information society, nobody thinks. We expected to banish paper, but we actually banish thought." Hammond turned to Gennaro and raised his hands. "You invited him." "And a lucky thing too," Malcolm said, "because it sounds as if you have a serious problem." "We have no problems," Hammond said quickly. "I always maintained this island would be unworkable," Malcolm said. "I predicted it from the beginning." He reached into a soft leather briefcase. "And I trust by now we all know what the eventual outcome is going to be. You're going to have to shut the thing down." "Shut it down?" Hammond stood angrily. "This is ridiculous." Malcolm shrugged, indifferent to Hammond's outburst. "I've brought copies of my original paper for you to look at," he said. "The original consultancy paper I did for InGen. The mathematics are a bit sticky, but I can walk you through it. Are you leaving now? I have some phone calls. I have some phone calls to make, Cameron said, and went into the adjoining cabin. Well, it's a long flight, Malcolm said to the others. At least my paper will give you something to do. The plane flew through the night. Grant knew that Ian Malcolm had his share of detractors, and he could understand why some found his style too abrasive, and his applications of chaos theory too glib. Grant thumbed through the paper, glancing at the equations. Janelle said, "Your paper concludes that Hammond's Island is bound to fail." "Correct." "Because of chaos theory?" "Correct." "To be more precise, because of the behavior of the system in phase space." Gennaro tossed the paper aside and said, "Can you explain this in English?" "Surely," Malcolm said. "Let's see where we have to start. You know what a nonlinear equation is?" "No." "Strange attractors?" "No." "All right," Malcolm said. "Let's go back to the beginning." He paused, staring at the ceiling. "Physics has had great success at describing certain kinds of behavior. Planets in orbit, spacecraft going to the moon, pendulums and springs and rolling balls, that sort of things. The regular movement of objects. These are described by what are called linear equations, and mathematicians can solve those equations easily. We've been doing it for hundreds of years." "Okay," Gennaro said, "but there is another kind of behavior which physics handles badly. For example, anything to do with turbulence. Water coming out of a spout, air moving over an airplane wing, whether blood flowing through the heart. Turbulent events are described by non-linear equations. They're hard to solve. In fact, they are usually impossible to solve. So physics has never understood this whole class of events until about 10 years ago. The new theory that describes them is called chaos theory. Chaos theory originally grew out of attempts to make computer models of weather in the 1960s. Weather is a big, complicated system, namely the Earth's atmosphere as it interacts with the land and the sun. The behavior of this big, complicated system always defied understanding, so naturally we could predict weather. But what the early researchers learned from computer models was that even if you could understand it, you still couldn't predict it. Weather prediction is absolutely impossible. The reason is that the behavior of the system is sensitively dependent on initial conditions. "You lost me," Gennaro said. "If I use a cannon to fire a shell of a certain rate at a certain speed and a certain angle of inclination, and if I then fire a second shell with almost the same rate, speed, and angle, what will happen? The two shells will land at almost the same spot." "Right," Malcolm said. "That's linear dynamics, okay? But if I have a weather system that I start up with a certain temperature and a certain wind speed and a certain humidity, and if I then repeat it with almost the same temperature, wind, and humidity, the second system will not behave almost the same. It'll wander off and rapidly will become very different from the first. Thunderstorms instead of sunshine. That's nonlinear dynamics. They are sensitive to initial conditions. Tiny differences become amplified." "I think I see," Gennaro said. "The shorthand is the butterfly effect. A butterfly flaps its wings in peaking and weather in New York is different. So chaos is all just random and unpredictable, Gennaro said. Is that it? No, Malcolm said. We actually find hidden regularities within the complex variety of a system's behavior. That's why chaos has now become a very broad theory that's used to study everything from the stock market to rioting crowds to brain waves during epilepsy, any sort of complex systems where there is confusion and unpredictability. We can find an underlying order, okay? Okay, Gennaro said. But what is this underlying order? It's essentially characterized by the movement of the system within phase space, Malcolm said. Jesus, Gennaro said. All I want to know is why you think Hammond's Island can't work. I understand, Malcolm said. I'll get there. Chaos theory says two things. First, that complex systems like weather have an underlying order. Second, the reverse of that simple systems can produce complex behavior. For example, pool balls. You hit a pool ball and it starts to caroom off the sides of the table. In theory, that's a fairly simple system. Almost a Newtonian system, since you can know the force imparted to the ball and the mass of the ball, and you can calculate the angles at which it will strike the walls. You can predict the future behavior of the ball in theory. You could predict the behavior of the ball far into the future as it keeps bouncing from side to side. You could predict where it will end up 3 hours from now, in theory, okay, Gennaro nodded. But in fact, Malcolm said, it turns out you can't predict more than a few seconds into the future. Because almost immediately, very small effects and imperfections in the surface of the ball, tiny indentations in the wood of the table, start to make a difference. And it doesn't take long before they overpower your careful calculations. So it turns out that this simple system of a pool ball on a table has unpredictable behavior. Okay. And Hammond's project, Malcolm said, is another apparently simple system. Animals within a zoo environment that will eventually show unpredictable behavior. You know this because of theory, Malcolm said. But hadn't you better see the island to see what he's actually done? No, this is quite unnecessary. The details don't matter. Theory tells me that the island will quickly proceed to behave in unpredictable fashion. And you're confident of your theory? Oh yes, Malcolm said. Totally confident. He sat back in the chair. There is a problem with that island. It is an accident waiting to happen. Isla Nublar. With our line, the routers began to swing in circles overhead, casting shadows on the runway of San Jose Airport. Grant listened to the crackle in his earphones as the pilot talked to the tower. They had picked up another passenger in San Jose, a man named Dennis Nedry, who had flown in to meet them. He was fat and sloppy, eating a candy bar, and there was sticky chocolate on his fingers and flecks of aluminum foil on his shirt. Nedry had mumbled something about doing computers on the island and hadn't offered to shake hands. Through the plexi bubble, Grant watched the airport concrete drop away beneath his feet. He saw the shadow of the helicopter racing along as they went west. Toward the mountains, it's about a 40-minute trip. Hammond said from one of the rear seats. Grant watched the low hills rise up, and then they were passing through intermittent clouds, breaking out into sunshine. The mountains were rugged, though he was surprised at the amount of deforestation acre after acre of denuded, eroded hills. Costa Rica, Hammond said, has better population control than other countries in Central America. But even so, the land is badly deforested. Most of this is within the last 10 years. They came down out of the clouds on the other side of the mountains, and Grant saw the beaches of the west coast. They flashed over a small coastal village. Bahia Anasco, the pilot said. Fishing village. He pointed north, up the coast. There you see the Cabo Blanco Preserve. They have beautiful beaches. The pilot headed straight out over the ocean. The water turned green, and then deep aquamarine. The sun shone on the water. It was about 10 in the morning. Just a few minutes now, Hammond said, and we should be seeing Isla Nubla. Isla Nubla, Hammond explained, was not a true island. Rather, it was a seamount, a volcanic upthrusting of rock from the ocean floor. Its volcanic origins can be seen all over the island, Hammond said. There are steam vents in many places, and the ground is often hot underfoot because of this, and so because of the prevailing currents. Isla Nubla lies in a foggy area. As we get there, you will see, there we are. The helicopter rushed forward. Low to the water ahead, Grant saw an island, rugged and craggy, rising sharply from the ocean. Christ, it looks like Alcatraz, Malcolm said. Its forested slopes were wreathed in fog, giving the island a mysterious appearance. Much larger, of course, Hammond said. 8 miles long and 3 miles wide. At the widest point in total, some 22 square miles, making it the largest private animal preserve in North America. The helicopter began to climb and headed toward the north end of the island. Grant was trying to see through the dense fog. It's not usually this thick, Hammond said. He sounded worried. At the north end of the island, the hills were rising more than 2,000 feet above the ocean. The tops of the hills were in fog, but Grant saw rugged cliffs and crashing ocean below. The helicopter climbed above the hills. Unfortunately, Hammond said, we have to land on the island. I don't like to do it because it disturbs the animals, and it's sometimes a bit thrilling. Hammond's voice cut off as the pilot said, starting our descent now. Hang on, folks. The helicopter started down, and immediately they were blanketed in a fog. Grant heard a repetitive electronic beeping through his earphones, but he could see nothing at all. Then he began dimly to discern the green branches of pine trees reaching through the mist. Some of the branches were close. How the hell is he doing this? Malcolm said, but nobody answered. The pilot swung his gaze left, then right. Looking at the pine forest, the trees were still close. The helicopter descended rapidly. Jesus, Malcolm said. The beeping was louder. Grant looked at the pilot. He was concentrating. Grant glanced down and saw a giant glowing fluorescent cross beneath the plexi bubble at his feet. There were flashing lights at the corners of the cross. The pilot corrected slightly and touched down on a helipad. The sound of the rotors faded and died. Grant sighed and released his seatbelt. We have to come down fast that way, Hammond said. because of the wind shear. There is often bad wind shear on this peak, and we're safe. Someone was running up to the helicopter, a man with a baseball cap and red hair. He threw open the door and said cheerfully, Hi, I'm Ed Regis. Welcome to Isla Nublar. Everybody, and watch your step, please." A narrow path wound down the hill. The air was chilly and damp. As they moved lower, the mist around them thinned, and Grant could see the landscape better. It looked, he thought, rather like the Pacific Northwest, the Olympic Peninsula. "That's right," Regis said. "Primarily ecology is deciduous rainforest, rather different from the vegetation on the mainland, which is more classical rainforest, but this is a microclimate that only occurs at elevation, on the slopes of the northern hills. The majority of the island is tropical." Down below, they could see the white roofs of large buildings nestled among the planting. Grant was surprised the construction was elaborate. They moved lower out of the mist, and now he could see the full extent of the island, stretching away from the south. As Regis had said, it was mostly covered in tropical forest. To the south, rising above the palm trees, Grant saw a single trunk with no leaves at all, just a big curving stump. Then the stump moved and twisted around to face the new arrivals. Grant realized that he was not seeing a tree at all. He was looking at the graceful, curving neck of an enormous creature rising 50 feet into the air. He was looking at a dinosaur. "Welcome." "My God," Ellie said softly. They were all staring at the animal above the trees. "My God." Her first thought was that the dinosaur was extraordinarily beautiful. Books portrayed them as oversized, dumpy creatures, but this long-necked animal had a gracefulness, almost a dignity about its movements. And it was quick. There was nothing lumbering or dull in its behavior. The sauropod peered alertly at them, and made a low trumpeting sound rather like an elephant. A moment later, a second head rose above the foliage, and then a third and a fourth. "My God," Ellie said again. Gennaro was speechless. He had known all along what to expect. He had known about it for years, but he had somehow never believed it would happen. And now he was shocked into silence. The awesome power of the new genetic technology, which he had formerly considered to be just so many words in an overwrought sales pitch. The power suddenly became clear to him. These animals were so big, they were enormous, big as a house, and so many of them, actual damn dinosaurs, just as real as you could want. Gennaro thought, "We are going to make a fortune on this place, a fortune." He hoped to God the island was safe. Grant stood on the path on the side of the hill, with the mist on his face, staring at the gray necks craning above the palms. He felt dizzy, as if the ground was sloping away too steeply. He had trouble getting his breath, because he was looking at something he had never expected to see in his life, yet he was seeing it. The animals in the mist were perfect apatosaurs, medium-sized sauropods. He stunned mind-made Academic Association, North American herbivores, late Jurassic horizon, commonly called brontosaurs, first discovered by E.D. Cope in Montana in 1876. Specimens associated with Morrison formation strata in Colorado, Utah, and Oklahoma. Recently, Berman and McIntosh had recently classified it as a Diplodocus based on the skull appearance. Traditionally, Brontosauruses were thought to spend most of its time in shallow water, which would help support its large bulk. Although this animal was clearly not in the water, it was moving much too quickly. The head and neck shifting above the palms in a very active manner, a surprisingly active manner. Grant began to laugh. What is it, Hammond said, worried. Is something wrong? Grant just shook his head and continued to laugh. He couldn't tell them what was funny was that he had seen the animal for only a few seconds, but he had already begun to accept it, and to use his observation to answer long-standing questions in the field. He was still laughing as he saw a fifth and the sixth neck crane up above the palm trees. The sauropods watched the people arrive. They reminded Grant of oversized giraffes. They had the same pleasant, rather stupid gaze. I take it they are not animatronic, Malcolm said. They are very lifelike. Yes, they certainly are, Hammond said. Well, they should be, shouldn't they? From the distance, they heard the trumpeting sound again. First one animal made it, and then the others joined in. That's their call, Edregis said, welcoming us to the island. Grant stood and listened for a moment, entranced. You probably want to know what happens next, Hammond was saying, continuing down the path. We've scheduled a complete tour of the facilities for you and a trip to see the dinosaurs. In the park later this afternoon. I'll be joining you for dinner, and we'll answer any remaining questions you may have then. Now, if you'll go with Mr. Regis. The group followed Regis towards the nearest buildings over the path. A crude hand-painted sign read, Welcome to Jurassic Park.